Director of Creative Services here at WaterFire, and I'd like to welcome you all to the WaterFire Art Center among the Networks Rhode Island exhibition. So thanks for being with us tonight. We're delighted to continue our partnership with Symposium Books, both with our bookstore out front, where we work with them to curate a collection of books, as well as events like this, supplemental programming, talks, and other things that we've been working with throughout the years with Symposium, including these WaterFire Symposiums. So WaterFire Symposium this evening, we're happy to kick these back off, and we're looking forward to working with Symposium Books, the team there, to create a series of events that will go through the fall and into the winter time. So take a look at our calendar, and we've got more events to come. One other thing I want to mention too is events will both be happening here and downtown. The other one that we just started up is called Silent Book Club. So we're actually creating space where you can sit for an hour or two and just come amongst a group of folks who are doing the same, grab your favorite book or a project that you might be working on, and come amongst the art and sit. So we'll set out some bistro tables, and we did one not too long ago, and we have another one coming up on Saturday. So that's at noon if you're interested. So definitely stop by, and it'll be out in the main hall so you can read and have your time among the incredible artwork. I also want to mention some upcoming events within this exhibition. So this exhibition is up until September 1st, Sunday, September 1st, and we do have 2 more artist panels the following 2 Thursday evenings, and as well as a closing gathering on the 29th, which is the last Thursday. We are also we just added a collector's discussion with Tripp. Thank you, Tripp, for volunteering to do that. He'll be back talking about art and collecting, as well as Barnaby and Vicky Bay. So that's on the 22nd, Tuesday the 22nd. It is an honor to have Tripp here tonight, longtime friend of WaterFire, an incredible encourager of all that we've been doing, particularly these last 2 years here at the Art Center. So incredibly grateful for your support, what we've been doing here. So it's an honor to have you talking about your passion and your work. Many of you, I'm sure, know Tripp. It doesn't need too much of an introduction, but an incredible award-winning art historian and professor at Wheaton College, which holds very dearly to us. He's given us incredible interns who have now turned into incredible staff, Emily Gray included. So thank you, Tripp, for your support, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation this evening. Books are in the store, so grab yours and get this man's signature.
Great. So can everybody hear me? All right. So I'm reciting up sound now. So if at any point you're having trouble hearing me, just give me a hands up. So it's a huge pleasure for me to be sharing some of this work with you all. As many of you all know, when your head gets deep into a project, sometimes it's hard to winnow out the coherent narrative for audiences that might be new to it. So tonight I'm going to be probably going a little bit all over the place in terms of thinking about how this project evolved. But to just start off with, just a little thumbnail, The Importance of Being Furnished, 4 Bachelors at Home, is a book about 4 men and 4 houses. 4 men from the late 19th to the early 20th century who all created houses that became public museums. So these are all houses that you can visit today. As an art historian, as someone who is interested in architectural history and American history and culture, this is really my field. And these guys are kind of case studies for something I'll be talking about a little bit tonight. But just to give you a sense of the kind of the scope of the project, it is both a book, and here it is, the day that it arrived. I'm a firm believer in opening up a nice bottle of Dom when a book is completed. So this was it when it came out in the beginning of June. It is also an exhibition. I think the through line here is me drinking. This is the night of the opening of the exhibition. The exhibition is hosted by Historic New England, which owns 2 of the properties that we'll be hearing about tonight. It opened at the end of June and goes all the way through October 27th. So for those of you all who are not familiar with where this is, the Eustis Estate is in Milton, Mass. About 35 minutes from here. It is an absolutely beautiful estate with grounds, and the galleries are all on the top floor. So it's worth a visit, you know, just for the house alone, but of course stay for the exhibition itself. So if you'll indulge me, I thought one way that I might get started with this material is to talk with you all a little bit about how I became obsessed with houses. So I'm going to start with a house that is not in the book. This is the house that my mother grew up in Richmond, Virginia. And this is a house that sort of occupies kind of the center of my childhood brain. Because as an Army brat, we lived in all different houses, different military bases. This was the one house that we always came back to. This was a house whose moldings and wainscoting and proportions really sort of fired my imagination as a child. And it had all these sort of weird archaic rooms. She had a telephone room, she had a little sleeping porch, and all these things you would never find in a house today. So this is me in the mid-'80s at Camp Max Welton for boys. The reason I'm showing this to you is that before I would go off to camp every summer, I would spend a week in 1821 Park Avenue in Richmond, and then when I left, I'd spend another week at the end. Those were the 2 weeks I really looked forward to in the summer, not the part in the middle where I was, playing lacrosse and basketball and softball and swimming and archery and riflery. No classes in wainscoting, no classes in moldings and the kinds of things that I was particularly interested in. Well, when I was in high school, sort of about the time that this picture of a very glum-looking Tripp was taken, my grandmother sold her house, and she was a little concerned because she said 2 bachelors had bought my house, 2 unmarried men. What on earth do 2 unmarried men want with my house? I was, about 15, and I had a pretty good idea who these guys were, and I also knew that the house was never in better hands. She couldn't have sold it to a better couple. So all of this is to sort of set the stage for the world in which bachelors could be seen as effective homeowners. And that begins way back, not the 1980s, but the 1880s with Oscar Wilde. So as the pun in the title of my book probably suggests to you all, Oscar Wilde is like the patron saint of my project. Oscar Wilde is the figure who kind of reframed the world that my 4 bachelors inherited. So when Wilde comes to America in 1882, he gives this really incredibly popular series of lectures over the course of an entire year, coast to coast. He goes to Boston twice. Boston was a huge center for the aesthetic movement, which was the movement that he was really the sort of spokesperson for. And the reason why this tour and Oscar Wilde are so important to the American house is that his lectures, his most popular lectures, were art decoration and the house beautiful. And in those lectures, he completely redefined the way that Americans thought about the American house. So here's his art decoration tour, or lecture, I should say. And his message to the youth of the land, he's talking to young men here, he says, is the passion for beauty engendered by the decorative arts will be to them more satisfying than any political or religious enthusiasm, any enthusiasm for humanity, any ecstasy or sorrow for love. So he was essentially saying that the American home, which had previously been seen almost exclusively in the terms of wives and mothers, the raising of children, the nurturing of marriage, had shifted radically in his message. His message was that not only does the American home not need a family, does not need a marriage, it may actually be more beautiful without those things. So his idea was that if a home could reflect a single kind of vision, and what comes to be seen is the single vision of kind of well-heeled young men, then all the better. So what happens in this period is that there's a collision of not only his message saying, the bachelor house is an aspirational model,
But you begin to see more bachelors, period, in America. In the 1880s and 1890s, there's this enormous surge in the numbers of unmarried men living in American cities with disposable incomes that they're spending on lavish bachelor apartments, lavish bachelor homes, and you begin to see statistics like this. In Boston, in 1890, 63,000 unmarried men. This is nearly a third of all the men in the city of any age. And what happens is that you begin to see a parallel phenomenon happening even well before Oscar Wilde appears in what I term bachelor literature. American readers became fascinated with this idea of bachelor homes and saw them as these aspirational homes. This would have been unthinkable for a generation before, who really saw homes as only the place for families. So Donald Grant Mitchell's Reveries of the Bachelor from 1850 went into something insane, like 25 editions. And it spawned all of these different sort of spin-offs, like Oliver Bell Bunce's Bachelor Bluff, his opinions, sentiments, and disputations. So this idea of bachelor literature goes right up into the 20th century. This is one of my favorites, Far from the Maddening Girls. This is Guy Wetmore Carroll writing in 1904 about a fictional figure, a guy who spends the entire novel fending off matrimony so that he can build his perfect house. This is not just a sort of a symptom of this milieu, but it also connects directly to my guys. So when this came out in 1904, it was dedicated to Henry Davis Sleeper, who was one of my 4 men. In furtherance of an unfulfilled intention, this book is dedicated to the author's dear friend and comrade, Henry D. Sleeper. And all evidence seems to suggest that Guy Wetmore Carroll and Henry Davis Sleeper were romantic partners as well. So he didn't fend off relationships entirely in his own life, even if that's what he was talking about in his books. So now that we've introduced Henry Sleeper, let me introduce you all to my 4 guys. So the 4 men that I've used as case studies, really, to explore this phenomenon of the late 19th, early 20th century of the so-called bachelor house include Charles Pendleton, who was a great collector of 18th century American and English furniture, primarily, and who left his collection to RISD. I'll talk about that collection a little bit further in a moment. Ogden Codman Jr., who's probably the best known of the 4. He was a very well-known designer and interior decorator of the kind of Gilded Age. He was working for the Vanderbilts and everyone else, in Newport and New York and elsewhere. Charles Gibson Jr., who was a prolific writer, lived in Boston, widely published at the beginning of the 20th century. And on the right, Henry Davis Sleeper, who created an extraordinary home called Beauport in Gloucester, Mass. Was also, like Ogden Codman, a decorator. So I am often asked, why these 4 guys? People will often come up to me and say, well, how come you're not writing about Henry Chapman Mercer? And how come you're not writing about that guy from Rochester? There's another one out in Wisconsin. You should be writing about him. The reason why I chose these 4 guys, well, aside from choosing 30, which I never would have got the book written, is that I wanted to create kind of a common denominator. These were all men from roughly the same time period, the same social class, the same region, and give or take, essentially the same profession. All of these men were engaged in professional interior design, really in the first years of that being kind of a professional career. So you might imagine that 4 guys from the same class, the same region, the same time would just churn out the same kind of boring interiors, or at least predictable, I should say, interiors. Instead, by taking the sort of common denominator here and choosing 4 guys who were so alike and should have been producing the same kinds of interiors, what happens instead is they take Oscar Wilde's gospel to heart, which is that your home is meant to reflect your personality, your particular kind of aesthetic vision. Oscar Wilde's Gospel of Beauty, as he called it, is something that really goes right up to our own time period. When you can't turn on HGTV today without some client saying, but where am I in this design? How does it reflect me? I don't see myself in these rooms. And that seems like such a reflexive, contemporary phenomenon. But that's what you're seeing with these guys. And in the show, and I'm going to give you all some glimpses of the show tonight. In the show at Eustis, each of the four galleries is its own aesthetic world. You're meant to walk in and feel that you've gone to an entirely different planet, even though they are four very different, even though they were from four very similar backgrounds. So I've introduced you to the guys. Let me introduce you to their houses. Several of these men, as I said, worked as designers for others. I made a specific choice with this project to focus only on the homes that were their own. I feel like there was a connection and really kind of a deep obsession that these men had with their own homes that they certainly didn't have with those, say, of clients. So going from left to right, Charles Pendleton, when he gives his collection to RISD in 1904, does so with the stipulation that they create a purpose-built wing to the museum that replicates his house at 72 Providence Street. It's a little bit gets lost in the translation, and I'll explain that a little bit further. Next, we have the Codman estate, which was home to 5 generations of Codman's family, beginning in the 1740s, beginning with his great-great-great-grandfather, and it was sort of redecorated in its final incarnation by Codman Jr. The Gibson House on the right is a townhouse in Back Bay. It was created by Gibson's grandmother. It's where he grew up and eventually became his museum. And Beauport really has to have its own slide. Beauport is so enormous and so complex. I couldn't shoehorn it in here. Beauport started as a relatively modest arts and crafts kind of bungalow on Gloucester. It became a 44-room house. And that sounds quite grand, but for anyone who has visited Beauport, every room is so intimate. It feels like you are walking into a slightly scaled up dollhouse. Because in some places you can actually touch the walls on either side. So 4 incredibly different expressions. And because we're on Beauport now, I just wanted to show you, and the title of this always cracks me up. This was the first guidebook made for Beauport when it became a museum. 1951, Beauport in Gloucester, the most fascinating house in America, all caps. And this gets to the point that what many critics have said in the men's own day and since about these houses is that they are unusual and eccentric and fascinating and magical and charming and all kinds of ways that people talk about but don't talk about what, you can almost think of it as sort of like a gay man's, sensibility. The thing that they're not talking about is why these men were confirmed bachelors, how it is that they put together these houses. And so by calling them sort of unusual and fascinating and eccentric, they are extending those metaphors to the men themselves. So in Wilde's own day, we're going to just jump back to Wilde for a second. Wilde too was seen as pre-trial, before the sort of end of his career. At the height of his career, of course, he was seen as a wit and an eccentric. He was always caricatured, as you can see in that caricature I showed you earlier on, as very fey and effeminate and limp-wristed. And in fact, the aesthetic movement itself that carves a space for these men was rampant with these kinds of sort of caricatures of sort of limp-wristed, effeminate, men. So it's not just Oscar Wilde, but others as well. So this leads to the question, because it is an important part of the book, it's an important part of the exhibition, what do we know about these men's personal lives? And to what extent does it matter? We know that at least 3 of the 4 men, Codman, Gibson, and Sleeper, all sustained same-sex relationships really throughout their lives. We know very little about Pendleton's private life, but as I argue in the book, Pendleton was very much, if he wasn't, predominantly gay himself, he was certainly perceived that way by his peers and written about that way. And so what I say, in the book is that, the Venn diagram, thinking about the men's sexuality and their sort of visual, kind of aesthetic, they don't entirely overlap, but I do think it's really important to think about their relationships and how their relationships kind of fashioned their houses and how it led to their own self-fashioning. I'll say as an aside, as a researcher, one of the things that was really exciting for me to find out was that Charles Gibson, so second from left, we knew that he had had all kinds of affairs in Boston. He was sort of infamous for this. But when you go into his archives, there, as you might imagine, there's nothing. There's no evidence whatsoever of any relationship with anyone, even though everyone kind of knew. But as a researcher, as a historian, that doesn't work. You can't work on just an absence. So thank goodness, Ogden Codman and his family left something like 200 linear feet of manuscript to historic New England. It is almost paralyzing for a researcher to try to find what you need to find in his stuff. But luckily enough, I'm going through Ogden Codman's letters from the 1890s, and he mentions Little Charlie. Like, that can't be Charlie Gibson. And then he mentions Little Charlie's mother, who is Rosamond. I'm like, it is Little Charlie. What I had found was an entire cache of letters written by Ogden Codman Jr. when he was in his 30s to his friend Arthur Little, another great colonial Bible architect, where Ogden Codman and Arthur Little are both scheming to figure out how they can bed Little Charlie Gibson, who was 18 at the time, but who had already sort of cut a swath through Boston. So Codman basically was able to lay out, for me as an historian, exactly what Gibson was up to. So here we've got Little Charlie and Arthur Little and Ogden Codman. So to sort of plot out these men's lives was something that then led me to thinking about how to thread this through in the exhibition. In some ways, it's easier to do that in a book than it is to do it with an exhibition. And the challenge for me was to do what is really essentially the first historic New England exhibition to really think about sexuality in a really sort of serious way, in the way that it intersects with material culture. So I'm going to be showing you some of the designers' kind of elevations for the show. I'll show you a couple of images of the show itself. But what I'd like to do now for the remainder of our time together is just sort of walk you through a little bit these galleries. I've been up at Usis Estate about, I don't even know how many times at this point, but 2 or 3 times a week I'm up there giving tours. So I'm so used to actually being able to have you all with me as I point to an object. So now I'm going to go back to the old way I did it before the show actually started. So all of the galleries bear the names of my chapter titles. So the first gallery that you walk into is Double Vision at the Codman Estate. And the Codman Estate, as kind of a place and an obsession of Codman's, is important to dwell on for a moment. This is the house where Ogden Codman lived until he was the age of 10, when his family, who were nearly bankrupted, not quite, by the 1872 Boston fire, had to rent out this house and move to France for 10 years and sort of recoup their income. What happens is that little Ogden Codman, and there it is, there's the house in 1872, taken actually months before the Boston fire. Circled in white there is little 10-year-old Ogden Codman. Codman then spends basically the rest of his childhood abroad in France. And for the rest of his life, even though he doesn't come back to live in this house, he is obsessed with it. It is sort of like, to use a Citizen Kane reference, like this is his rosebud. This is his touchstone for when the family kind of had it all, and when their prestige was kind of unquestioned, before the kind of humiliation of what he called his exile in France. So it's telling that as late as his 70s, he is writing his siblings who continue to live here, saying, I'm so homesick for Lincoln. And you read it and think, dude, you have not lived there since you were 10. How on earth would you be homesick for it? He's probably homesick for it the same way I'm homesick for 1821 Park Avenue in Richmond. It lodged in his brain in this way that was really, really powerful. So the reason for the name of this gallery, Double Vision at the Codman Estate, is that not only is there this kind of pull of the ancestral home, so important for Codman, and important really for his career as a decorator as well, but there's also a kind of a magnetic pull between 2 other poles for him in his life. And that is between sort of notions of excess and propriety. And the easiest way to think about it is to look at these two portraits. So these are, on the right, Ogden Codman Jr.'s great-great-grandfather, who really founds the Codman dynasty and enlarges the house, and John Codman III's brother, Richard Codman. I'm so excited to show these paintings have never hung together before, so it's really cool to see them actually facing off. These are the two poles. These are the angel and the devil that sat on Codman's shoulders for his whole life. On the right, John Codman III was a stalwart, conservative, traditional New England Yankee family man. Loved home, loved going to church, loved his mama, all of the things that Codman really wanted to be seen as. Richard, who was known in the family as Bad Uncle Richard, entered a business partnership with John Codman III in the 1790s, which was probably the worst business decision that this very good businessman actually made. He tells his brother Richard, go to revolutionary Paris, this is the 1790s, and establish trade relations with the revolutionary government. They had this extraordinary sort of multinational merchant trade kind of operation. They said, and sell our commodities to this new government. Richard gets to Paris, and his first thought is, chateaux are so cheap right now. Nobody seems to be living in them. He bought one, he bought two, he bought three, he bought four, he bought 5 chateaux. And to do this, he is liquidating basically the company's capital and its commodities. John Codman III doesn't know this yet, but Bad Uncle Richard, handsome devil that he is, unmarried, is installing his mistresses in each one of these houses. He's redoing all of the houses. So finally in 1800, John Codman III comes over and he's like, what the hell is going on? Where's all our money? Makes him resell all of the, he sends them home in humiliation to Boston. But what happens with Ogden Codman, several generations later, is that he worships both of these guys. He wants to be both of these guys. He wants to be the good conservative Yankee. He also wants to be the flashy spendthrift expat. He falls on the side of Bad Uncle Richard. And in fact, this portrait of Uncle Richard was Ogden Codman Jr.'s most prized possession. He bought it in 1917 from his uncle for the equivalent of about $80,000 in today's money. So this was a favorite of his. So when I talk about those two poles, you can see it in his houses, you can see it in his work. There's the Codman estate on the right, kind of a North Star for Codman Jr. later on. Here is one of Bad Uncle Richard's chateaux. And what happens is that when he begins to make a little bit of money as a designer, Ogden Codman Jr., one of the first things he wants to do is fix up the family house, and then he wants to buy one of Uncle Richard's chateaux, so he can sort of live the life of Uncle Richard, that sort of life of excess. Around the same time period, when he's using his family home as kind of a design laboratory in the 1890s, he and his distant cousin, Edith Wharton, connect in Newport. Nobody really knew Edith Wharton as a writer at this point. And he and Edith Wharton shared a certain kind of Francophile aesthetic. They loved sort of chateaus, sort of ancien regime designs. And so in 1897, they put together the decoration of houses. It has never gone out of print. It was a hit from the very beginning. It was probably, I think it was probably one of the most towering volumes on American decoration in the 19th or I would say in the 20th century, filled with images of French chateau. This is straight out of the book of Uncle Richard, and thinking about this as the aspirational model. Well, that idea of excess on the one hand and propriety on the other is not just a part of his ethos as a decorator, where he's designing for Gilded Age clients a New England parlor next to Louis XVI, bedroom. But while he's putting together all of these hundreds of photographs, historic photographs of Chateau, assembling a really important collection, he is assembling another collection as well of pornography. And I've gotten more flack for this case in this show, but I insisted on putting it in. And you can't help but laugh when you think about him putting together this frosty treatise on architectural decor and how to put together a ballroom and where your footman is supposed to be. And meanwhile, he's writing the same Arthur Little who was gossiping about little Charlie with, and he's writing it and saying, when you go to Rome, here are the 3 studios where you need to get photographs for me. Send them to me. So we have the letters of him asking for the photographs. We have the photographs themselves. My favorite line that he writes to Arthur Little, he says, when you send it to the house, for God's sakes, remember to put Junior after my name. Convince his father to be able to name his son. The shot on the right is an amateur shot by his brother Tom. It appears that he and Tom, who's also gay, shared this collection. And the collection is part of that 200 linear feet of manuscript items that Historic New England owns. It's really kind of an incredible collection. I am so proud of the fact that I have my very first curated show kind of warning you. Although I will have to say, when it says contains nude photographs that are sexual in nature, I told the site manager, and I said, these are men lying around like seals. Like I could have chosen something a little bit brandier, but I didn't. So when I say that ultimately Ogden Codman kind of comes down to the side of bad Uncle Richard, this is the palace on the Riviera that really ruins Codman actually in the end. It's such a like a fable or sort of morality play. What happens is that Codman marries, and this is from the exhibition. Codman, to everyone's astonishment, marries one of his clients in 1904, a very, very wealthy widow, many years his senior, who I think had no, kind of illusions about the marriage that she was going into. She lived for a couple of years and conveniently dies, leaves him, a colossal fortune. So he puts together La Leopolda, again, one of the most extravagant palaces ever built to this day on the Riviera. But the stock market crash happens right in the middle of construction. So he loses a lot of capital. He never ends up being able really to spend a night here. He rents it out for the rest of his life. And he blames, this is him with his secretary / companion, he blames Ronnie Howdow for being behind the whole scheme. He breaks up with Ronnie Howdow over this. He says, wow, I never would have taken this on if it hadn't been for Ronnie. So if we move from Codman to Pendleton, the name for the Pendleton Gallery is The Ghost of Charles Pendleton. Pendleton is an interesting story. He grows up in Westerly, Rhode Island, to kind of wealthy farmers. So he's not like a blue blood in any way. He doesn't have generational wealth. He goes to Andover, he goes to Yale, he gets expelled from Yale his first year for reasons that are not entirely clear. And from that point forward, he destroys any material connected to his private life. It's for that reason that the only image that we have of him is this image of him as a 15-year-old, which always seems sort of jarring when you go into the gallery and you see this picture of a teenager next to the intro label. So what we do know about Charles Pendleton is that he was a major collector and dealer of 18th century furniture, probably one of the best in the 19th century. And he was also a great gambler. This was often how he kind of fueled his collection. And you know when he was up or when he was down by when he had big sales. So he would sort of, build the collection, and then wham, everything would be sold. And the Providence Journal was always sort of covering these sales. He was bankrupted probably 3 or 4 times, and he was not always on the up and up as a dealer either. He often sold things that were improved or married or combined from other pieces. Not entirely unlike stuff that his peers were up to. But when he dies, he decides that he wants to give, when he's dying, he decides he wants to give his collection to RISD. But he wants to do it in a very particular way. He wants RISD to recreate his house on Walnut Street. It doesn't translate directly, and I'll explain why they don't look particularly alike on the outside. But what he's doing with this gift is trying to enshrine forevermore the moment when he was at his highest. And that moment goes from 1897 to 1904. in 1897, he moves from a boarding house in downtown Providence, where he was living with roommates, into this house. Suddenly, he's got this grand federal home. His fortunes have risen to the point that he has these kind of extraordinary interiors. And when RISD takes over this task, recreate his house, memorialize his sort of greatest moment, you can see that some things were lost in translation. So this is the front entry hall of his house. This is Pendleton House at RISD. What RISD did almost from the beginning was to entirely rebrand his collection and who he is. And I'll say, and maybe we've got some RISD folks here now, but it is sometimes an awkward moment in talking about this, that RISD still, the kind of party line, is the rebranding that they did in 1907. So what happens is this basically kind of aesthetic movement interior filled with beautifully colored jewel-toned carpets, really sort of eye-popping Chinese ceramics, and kind of B-grade old master paintings that served as props for his paintings. RISD gets rid of the rugs, gets rid of most of the ceramics, switches out the paintings for Gilbert Stuart's and Copley's and good American artists. And then they looked at his furniture collection and said, let's put all the English stuff in storage and show the American pieces. And voila, we have a patriotic supporter of American colonial culture, who believed in American craft and in the exceptionalism of American aesthetics. This really has nothing to do with how he assembled his collection. My sense is that he loved English Chippendale above everything. If he found a piece that was from Newport or Philadelphia, that sort of rose to the level of English Chippendale, he bought it. And that's really what you see when you go to RISD today. The other sort of sleight of hand that happens here is actually Pendleton's own. When I was doing the research for the book, one of the things I wanted to find out was just how much he paid for this house in 1897. Like, how big of a windfall was this? So I got the title to the house, and I'm looking. Pendleton never owned this house. He was a renter. So the Brown family owned it. So he was a renter here, and if the debts on his estate are any kind of indication, he was probably about this close to being kicked out of the house. There were about $40,000 worth of debts on his estate when he gave the gift. Thank you very much. Here's the gift with all of my debts. That basically the Metcalf family, who had founded RISD and the RISD Museum, had to settle on his behalf. So in the gallery devoted to Pendleton, the designer has done this really extraordinary thing that is very hard to capture in photographs. But he's done kind of a virtual reality, to-scale image of 72 Waterman, so you feel as if you're walking into the original house. His rug kind of comes out to meet you. The furniture is at the right scale, so this is his card table, his kind of banished old masters, his banished Qing Dynasty days, all seem to be sort of coming out of this sepia image as if it is coming to life. And that was something I really wanted to emphasize here, because in calling this gallery in this chapter The Ghost of Charles Pendleton, one of the things that I really was trying to draw out was the way in which this guy with a questionable reputation, there's the Yale expulsion, there's all of the bankruptcies, there's the kind of questionable practices as a dealer, by giving this gift to RISD, he wanted to create a theatrical stage set and an avatar for himself, where Pendleton disappears. In his place is a spotless, impeccably, kind of respectable, generic 18th century gentleman. And in fact, that's how RISD, from that point, from the beginning to today, talk about these interiors. They say that these are the interiors that a wealthy man of taste in the 18th century would have lived. They don't mention Pendleton. So one of the spots that I absolutely love in the Pendleton Gallery is this juxtaposition of an English mirror, banished because English, to storage at RISD, and the intervention that the extraordinary artist Beth Kavanaugh made in 2019 at Pendleton House. Pendleton House, for all of its sort of strangeness and all of its kind of mystery, the kind of clings to it, as you can imagine, has become kind of catnip for contemporary artists. And so what Beth Cattleman wanted to do with her intervention at Pendleton House was, one, to sort of honor the Chippendale kind of silhouettes that he was so enamored of. But she goes a little further, and she starts sort of talking about Pendleton himself. This is called the shipwreck mirror. One side of her installation is shipwreck, one side is paradise, the sort of gambler's two poles. And there is a foundering ship with Gale's crest on it, referencing his expulsion, these sort of, tomb-like references to the house itself being sort of like a tomb. And then she even creates an avatar for Pendleton himself, Colonel Sanders, at the bottom, which I love. And, in effect, he was entirely effective in disappearing into this house. In fact, RISD curators have told me that RISD students approached them not too long ago and said, we should really have a plaque in this house that acknowledges the fact that Pendleton was a slave owner. And she said, he was born in 1878. You have no idea who this guy is. He has so effectively become an 18th century person that it confuses everyone who steps into that house. So third, I know we're getting, I'm going long here. I'll try to do justice to these last two gentlemen in the time we've got left. Stepping into the sleeper or Beauport room, which is like love and magic on Eastern Point. The title for this gallery sort of comes from this notion that everyone who visits Beauport says it's a house that feels magical. It's a house that feels like it's casting a spell on you. And it's true that when people leave, they leave with a grin on their face, and they're not entirely sure why the house has affected them in the way that it has. Well, I make the argument in the book and in the show that love is actually the secret ingredient to the magic in this house. And that you cannot understand this house without understanding the profound relationship between these two men. So this is the introductory wall. We're looking at Henry David Sleeper at left, the architect of Beauport, the designer of Beauport, and Piatt Andrew on the right. At a fateful dinner party in April 1906, these two men were seated together at a Boston event. Piatt Andrew, whose home was called Red Roof out on Gloucester, invites Henry David Sleeper to come out for lunch. Henry David Sleeper falls head over heels for Piatt Andrew and for Eastern Point, and loses no time in buying the property closest to Piatt Andrews and telling him, good news, we're going to get to see each other every day. This was, sadly in some ways, it was an unrequited passion. Piatt Andrew conducted numerous affairs with mostly young, athletic Harvard men. He was a Harvard professor at the time. I think Henry David Sleeper was really just not his type. But Sleeper sort of holds a torch for him the rest of his life and uses Beauport in a way to kind of charm him. In the book, I call Beauport an architectural geisha performance. It is like him constantly saying, I have a new dining room, I have a new wing, you've got to come see my new library. I love the body language of the man in this. It's just so telling. Poor Piatt Andrew. We often have letters that Sleeper wrote to Piatt Andrew. We don't have the others. But I thought it was worthwhile pointing out this one really important letter from 1908. Arthur Little, the same one who was friends with Ogden Cotman Jr. This is Sleeper writing to Andrew. Arthur Little has just written me a very laudatory letter. It was flattering, and I haven't mentioned it to anyone, even Mother, yet. The only reason I speak of it now is because I've been thinking I should never have taken the pains I did, nor would Beauport have existed but for you. So he admits as much that Beauport is, becomes a 44-room love poem. And this is the room that in many ways is probably the clearest example of his making a direct appeal to Piatt Andrew. This is the so-called octagon room or souvenir de France room. It is all done in these sparkling reds. And people, critics from the 20s on have always said, this is the most important room at Beauport. This is the most important room of its period for American interior decoration. All of these sort of symphony of reds. Where on earth did he get the idea for all of these reds? Well, all you have to do is look 2 doors down to Red Roof, where everything was about the color red. Pied Andrew was so associated with the color red that another mutual friend of theirs, Isabel Stewart Gardner, used to write to him in red ink. They used to exchange letters on red paper. So it goes on and on. And so I argue in the book that this really is a kind of love offering to Pied Andrew, created in precisely the year that Pied Andrew became a Massachusetts congressman and left Eastern Point. So this was kind of the farewell. And Souvenir de France is a souvenir of the 1 year that Pied Andrew and Sleeper spent together in Paris during World War I. So in the first guidebook that you saw from 1951, it said, this is a room that celebrates Franco-American relations. So, well, it celebrates relations. And even its shape, it's an octagonal shape, which is the same shape of the so-called sailor's valentines that Sleeper collected. These were romantic gifts that sailors would give to their sweethearts in the 19th century. Not only did Sleeper collect them, but he gave one, as you would not be surprised, to Pied Andrew, and he redecorated for him. And I argue that this entire room is a sailor's valentine to Pied Andrew. Oh, and last, to show you quickly, another great room from Beauport, that if you see the show, you'll get to see something that no longer exists at the house. This extraordinary life-size pagoda that he created in these kind of bonkers, so-called China trade room, where I have a piece of the True Cross in the show, one fragment left over from this pagoda. All right, so we'll wrap up by taking a quick look at Charlie Gibson. Gibson's project was quite different from the other three. His grandmother creates 137 Beacon Street when Back Bay was brand new. It was one of the first houses built west of the public garden, and she was one of the first women builder, one of the first single women, I should say. She was widowed to build a house there. This is the installation at the Eustis Estate. By the time that Charlie Gibson is forming his childhood home into a museum, he's really seeing himself primarily as a writer. That's one of the reasons why you see that entire wall of one of his poems kind of blown up room size. And people who visit Gibson House today often think of it as this sort of Boston Brahmin kind of unbroken chain from grandmother to son to grandson. There is a significant break in that chain, and it has to do with Charlie. Between 1900 and 1916, Charlie Gibson and his father had a complete falling out. In fact, his father disinherits him in 1916. Charlie's in it for the long game. His mother lives until 1934, and when his mother dies and his sisters inherit the house, they sell him the house for $1. He almost immediately decides, this is going to be my legacy. I'm going to turn this house into a museum, and I'm going to turn it into a legacy to my writing. We'll come back to that in a second. To my writing and to my family. So here's the interior of it. It is really an untouched late Victorian townhouse. It is really an important artifact on the sort of Boston preservation scene. But as much as he was trying to preserve the interiors that his grandmother and his mother had put together, he wanted it also to enshrine his career as a writer. And here's his first book that he wrote under a pseudonym of Richard Sudbury. The reason why he wrote it under a pseudonym is also part of the reason why he was disinherited by his father. Charlie Gibson, as you might have gathered from Alkenkampen's kind of raunchy letters about this young man, Charlie Gibson cut quite a swath through gay Boston in the 1890s. People sort of knew about this, but it was kind of quietly tolerated until his affair with Maurice de Talbot, the self-styled Count de Moniz, a fake French count, who came over to Boston. He was a kind of a popular lecturer. And Charlie installs him at 137 Beacon Street. They have adjoining bedrooms, and all of Boston just starts going bananas about this. When Codman writes to his mother about this, he says, Boston is talking about not Gibson, the Gibsons, in the most horrid ways. The whole family was kind of dragged into this scandal. When Two Gentlemen in Terrain comes out, the scandal was fresh in the minds of just about everyone. And it is a book about a Boston Brahmin who befriends a handsome French count, and they go traveling in Terrain. So those who knew the story behind the novel were really just kind of made really uncomfortable by it. In fact, one of Charlie's best friends, his cousin, who married an English peer, she became Lady Playfair. Lady Playfair writes him and says, "Charlie, thank you so much for sending your book. It is beautifully bound, it is easy to hold, and the typeset is very well chosen." And so he learned from that point forward not to write, novels too close to the bone. But most of his writing that he's doing from the 1930s on really is writing about the house itself. He wants it to become a museum. So this is his epiphany at left, where he's getting ready to go to his summer house, putting up 137 Beacon Street, Gibson House, Gibson Museum, for 1 or 2 years marking everything. It's not often you find the smoking gun for a project. This is it, that day. So he starts making all these labels for everything in the house and room guides for things now. Talks about himself in the third person, where he says, "This is the piano where Mr. Gibson played. Many said he had the touch of a professional." He was obsessed with his family, and especially his mother's side. His mother was a Warren of, General Warren of the hero of Bunker Hill. You can see just to the right of the family tree. This thing in the center is called the Pedigree of Warren, and it sat dead center in the front hall. When you came into the house, you saw his pedigree from his grandparents back to, William the Conqueror, and then some. It's about 16 or 17, mostly kind of made up generations. And in the house, he decides that he's going to change nothing. But given this sort of difficult relationship he has with his father, he changes 2 important rooms. They were the rooms that were most important to his father, who disapproved of his son's calling as a poet, disapproved of all kinds of things in regard to his son's life, and whose bedroom, this was his father's bedroom, that he turns into his writing studio, which I just love, that he's sort of shaking his fist across the grave. The other room that was really important to his father was his library. You can see Charlie Gibson sitting in the library in his 70s. When Charlie moves into the house, he removes his father's picture of a stag hunt above the fireplace and puts me. 3 portraits of the youthful Charlie. And so I argued in the book, and we were able to put them in the show over another fireplace. I argue in the book that as much as people have written about Gibson House Museum as a legacy project of him putting a bell jar over his mother's decorating and over his literary career, I also think the house is a kind of like a version of the picture of Dorian Gray. I mean, the house is a monument to when he was hot and young and desirable. And you see it everywhere in the house. You cannot go in a room in that house without a beautiful picture of the youthful Charlie Gibson staring out at you. And you will see that in the show as well. I think there's something like 12 images of Gibson that are sort of staring out at you from every wall. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of a glimpse of these 4 house projects. I do want to end with, I'm always very self-conscious about reading for my own stuff. It always feels weird, like I'm sort of like a now from the book of Tripp. But I'm going to do it anyway, so you'll just have to indulge me while you've got these guys on the screen. This is in the book, it's obviously not in the show, and it really reflects sort of how I was feeling when I finished this project. I didn't want to write a full-scale, kind of epilogue. Instead, there's just like a 1.5-page coda to the book, where I'm sort of thinking, what's in my head as I wrap up this project? So here's the beginning of the coda. What lasts in the end? These 4 houses, most of their contents, some of their views, and to greater or lesser degrees, the integrity of their interior arrangements. But what becomes of the profound joys and wicked disappointments, the thrill of ambition and rage of loss, the triumphant pride and haunting shame that once boiled inside their walls? What happens to the homesickness, the madness, the yearning for beauty, status, love, or all 3 that once set these rooms ablaze? Where does it all go? We might ask the same question of our own mortal bodies. But if I believe in anything, it's that the material object, whether a shoe worn to a ball, there is one at Gibson House, or a 46-room love poem, contains resurrective powers. I hold as an article of faith that our houses, if not our lives, hold the key to a kind of eternity. Thanks very much. So, thoughts, questions? People want to know some more tea about any of these guys?
I have a question from kind of left field.
Yeah.
Which I remember reading in your first chapter that the Chippendale style, that was beloved by Charles Pendleton, was known for being a very masculine style. Here's the left field part. Is there any connection between the furniture and the male dancer group? The Chippendales?
Oh! I never thought about that, but like that may be the best question I've ever gotten. And now I'm like sad that I didn't address it. But yeah, I mean, to address the first part of your question, yeah, absolutely. The Chippendale style, in a really interesting way, was talked about in kind of homoerotic ways. So people who collected Chippendale talked about its muscular curves and its sinewy elements and its strong presence. These are pieces that are always called handsome. As you probably remember from that chapter, one of my favorite Freudian slips that he makes in his inventory for RISD is describing handsome secretary, handsome tea table. And at one point he says, mansome chest of drawers. Yes. But, you know, I mean, I think that there could well be a connection to the idea of Chippendale and masculinity. The other thing that I wanted to blow up big in the gallery that we just didn't have enough space was right around the time that Chippendale's Cabinetmaker's Director comes out, William Hogarth in England publishes a very famous plate called The Analysis of Beauty. And in this plate, he's talking about why, among other visual expressions, English furniture of that period had reached its apogee, why it was so beautiful. And so he's got little Chippendale legs all around the corners of this plate. And at the center of it is just a bunch of gentlemen looking at sort of Greek male nudes and sort of admiring the curves and sort of seeing how the curves are. I mean, the connection is absolute there. I wanted to include it in the exhibition, but it was such a long walk to make that point that I figured like anybody coming into the gallery would have fallen asleep before they got to like my little academic point. But I think that the way that these guys collected, I think is really telling. They collected things that I think were connected to their heart and lower parts and relationships. What else? Yes.
Is there one of these gentlemen that you admire or favorite?
I know the one that you were jealous of. This is my husband, folks. So I like Sleeper. I fell under the spell of Quiet Andrew myself. At a certain point, I was saying, like, should I be worried? It's like, if he was alive, oh. He should be. But of these four guys, it's interesting because as an historian, and we've talked about this, like as an historian, you get to know these figures, and you either like them or you don't like them, or the ones that you're really drawn to become the ones that sort of lodge in your brain so much. I think Sleeper would have been the nicest of them all, the sweetest of them all. He was a really you got what there was no artifice there at all. Cobden would have been kind of fun at a dinner party, because he was really kind of gossipy and a little bitchy. Pendleton, we don't really know. And Gibson, I think Gibson would actually have been entertaining for his narcissism. He was so involved in being like the most handsome guy in the room that I think he would have been kind of fun to hang out with. And in fact, in his 70s and going into his 80s, he had kind of like a little cult following of Harvard undergraduates who would come over and play mahjong at 137 Wheaton Street with the guy, they called him Uncle Charlie. And they would all come over and sort of, he would kind of fake flirt with them, and they would say, oh, Uncle Charlie. And they were all interviewed in the 70s and 80s. So they all had these really interesting, very, very strong personalities. The only one I can't get a beat on is Pendleton, and that's by design. I mean, he wanted to cover up his tracks to the point where you have no idea who this person is. Probably told you too much. Yeah, Barbie.
Wasn't Pendleton involved in sort of competitive collecting with someone in Providence? And was that also a bachelor collector or not? What was the relationship between them?
Yeah, so the trio of Chippendale collectors were Marsden Perry, Richard Canfield, and Pendleton. And, you know, they were all very charismatic collectors, at one point bachelor collectors. Perry and Canfield were both straight and had these restraining affairs with women and were married occasionally and often. But the difference between him and those two other collectors is that Canfield made money hand over fist as not quite legitimate owner of a string of gambling houses in Saratoga Springs and in New York. So he had tons of capital. And in fact, Pendleton decorated a lot of his gambling houses to kind of class him up. Like the idea was that he was going to sort of make them look respectable. Marsden Perry, who he's got his fingers in everything. He's a utilities magnate, he's into banking, he's into downtown real estate. So he's in competition with these guys who are also big gamblers. So you can imagine him sitting around a card table, in fact, the very card table I showed you all in that image. And he just loses his shirt because he's so in over his head with these guys, and yet he knew, and he was right, that he had a better eye, and he knew how to find this stuff better than the other guys. So he tended to be kind of a dealer to them, more so than sort of competing at the same, say, auctions. But Pendleton, you know, you really see him getting in over his head with these folks. And they're kind of a shadowy world of gambling folks and sort of, you know, businessmen who are not always, you know, on the up and up. Yes?
Thank you so much, Tripp. Two things. I have a question regarding the objects in the exhibition. I have a very funny thing that I'm remembering from this. So when I was a little girl, when we used to work at Bisbee, we used to have tours with the director. And there was a past director that brought us through behind the scenes, and there was one room, this is many years ago, that had all those extra pieces of Pendleton House. And I remember thinking, the rugs, the color, it was just very fascinating. I'm sure it's not how things are stored now because it doesn't seem to be how things should have been stored at the time. And so I just remember when someone was asking about that on the tour, the director at the time was like, oh, these are all the extra bits of Pendleton that we can't fit in the house. So kind of interesting, can't fit
They
in
can't
the
fit into the
narrative.
story.
Exactly. The narrative. So that was very interesting. It was like, and it was funny, was all the Pendleton extras were facing this huge Fernando Botero family portrait. So it was a weird thing going on there, which I remember as a kid going, something's happening here. And second, I just wanted to ask you, the pagoda piece, what happened to that structure?
Oh, thank you for asking, because I could fly over that story.
Yeah,
It's
I
one of
was
my
just
favorite
fascinated. You
stories.
have this beautiful, carving. I was wondering what happened to it.
All right, so first, just a word about the Pendleton stuff in storage. RISD cannot deaccession any of it, so it stays in storage, in limbo forevermore. And some of the pieces are like not good enough to restore, but not in good enough shape to show. And so it's in this total limbo period. But it has to do with them telling this very different story. The pagoda is its own kind of frustrating story for me. That room, the China trade room that I showed you, was the only room at Beauport that was changed from Sleeper's time. So when Sleeper dies in 1934, there are 14 mortgages on the house. He gives it to his brother. And again, sort of like the RISD gift, like thanks for this house with 14 mortgages. But the Woolworth heiress, Helena Woolworth McCann, buys it. When she buys it and settles all the mortgages, Henry Francis DuPont of Winterthur fame writes her and says, don't change anything. It is an artistic installation, and the value of the house is in its arrangements. And then he says the fatal line, but I've never liked the China trade room, so have at it. And so she does. She gets rid of all the furniture in that room. She dismantles the pagoda, and the pagoda was this totally nuts structure that went into his bedroom. So when people were assembled for drinks in that room, he could just sort of pop out of the pagoda and like, you know, say hello to people. So clearly that was the centerpiece of the room for him. When I started this planning for this show, I had this dream of rebuilding the pagoda in the show, because Historic New England still owns it. And the reason that they still own it, and they own all of its parts, it's all there, is that when the McCanns dismantled it, Pi Andrew, who had died, I think, the year before they dismantled the China Trade Room, Andrew's chauffeur was part of the demo team. He was heartbroken at having to take down this thing that he knew was so important to Sleeper, and he asked the McCanns, "Can I have the pagoda?" And they said, "Sure, we don't care, take it." So he takes the pagoda, stores it at the Red Roof Chauffeur's cottage, where it stayed until the 1980s. Then one of his descendants ends up giving it to Historic New England. So I had known all this time, like, you got the parts. You've been hanging on to it since the 80s. First of all, the frustration was, "Can I see it?" And they're like, "Oh, it's too hard to bring out of storage." I'm like, "Why are you keeping it? A scholar can't see it." So finally they bring it out of storage and said, "All right, we've got to rebuild this thing. We've got to make it for the show." And it was, I think, a bridge too far. I think, Barbie, if I'd had you, they would have done it immediately. It's exactly the kind of thing that you do for your own shows. That somehow, you know, I didn't have to pull. And so they said it's going to be too expensive, it's too big. I still hold out hope that one day they will put it all back together, maybe in their permanent collections facility, which is going to be turned into kind of like a public museum. But it's an extraordinary structure. And to me, there's nothing more resonant of the way that his rooms, especially towards the end of his life, got more and more kind of, they kind of lost touch with reality. And I think that's sort of where his mind was at the end. He was like, I'm just gonna go sit in my pagoda and forget that my Andrew doesn't live here anymore. So thank you for asking about that.
Sure, that's great. You showed one piece of it. Is that from that larger collection, or is one piece left in the original house?
No, so let's go back to the pagoda.
Yeah,
There it is. Whoops. So that is as much as Historic New England would let me haul out of storage. I was like, can't we bring like the roof or like one of the columns or something? And they're like, you can have one of the chicken snakes. I mean, they're hilarious. And Sleeper had a really, really funny sense of humor. And you get that when you look at this close up, you're like, of course, it's a rooster that looks like a snake. You know, his house is filled with visual jokes. And I think people don't often appreciate what a wicked sense of humor he had, and that he shared with Pi Andrew. In fact, Pi Andrew wrote to a mutual friend of theirs once and said, is Harry Sleeper, does he still have, you know, the raunchy sense of humor that I remember from last summer? And there are some kind of fun, you know, kind of dirty jokes in the house that I think were absolutely intentional.
But you've also got 3 pagodas in the room.
Well, okay, now I'm gonna go down my rabbit hole. All right, so this room was so brilliant, and of all the rooms to get dismantled, this is the one that it's like a knife in my heart. Because what he did when he created this room was, first of all, he found genuine 18th century hand-painted scrolls that had been ordered by a New England banker in the 1780s, had never come out of their shipping crate. So he found them completely untouched. And so that was the genesis of the room. The room had been an English medieval hall, and he sort of like Auntie Mame decides like, English medieval is out, now it's gonna be all Chinese, you know, in this room. He puts up all of the wallpaper, and then, just as you say, he puts in a life-size pagoda, he tents the ceiling of the room, so the whole room becomes a pagoda. And then he puts in all of these pagoda models. So there are all these different scales of pagodas, and so there's this dizzying sense, and he's burning incense in here. So this dizzying sense of the scale, it's like Alice in Wonderland. The pagodas are shrinking in front of you, and then you're in one, and then you're in a bigger one that's inside the other one. It's really, you know, kind of genius, and it's a great example too of the way that the wallpaper is all cutaways of pagodas. So in a sense, this was like a virtual reality of him allowing visitors to walk into the wallpaper, effectively, and be one of the characters. in the wallpaper. And I mentioned in probably one of the most academically belabored sections of my book, this whole theory I have about garden follies. Garden follies in English landscapes are meant to be little kind of moments of whimsy within an otherwise rational setting. They're meant to sort of delight you, and then there's a palate cleanser of landscape, and you get delighted again by something weird, and then a palate cleanser. Beauport there is no relief. It is folly, inside a folly, inside a folly, inside another folly, and they're all indoors. So he's turned outside in, and turned this room into, I think, one of the greatest set of nested follies ever made. In the book, I couldn't help myself. I said, it was so gothic, this sensibility, this sort of weird sensibility. It was sort of like these gothic novels where there's like, a madman living in the attic. And guess what? He had one of those too, because his brother was dying from tertiary syphilis in an upstairs bedroom. Almost like this living embodiment of the mania that is going on downstairs. When Netflix buys the series about houses, we have to get Jacob Sleepering's syphilitic self in there. That might be the worst way to ever end.